Today, we're going to talk about my favorite video game franchise of all time, that is
Resident Evil.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rate all of the Resident Evil games from 1 to 10, starting with the original Resident Evil. Side note, none of the offshoots and side stories. This is strictly mainline Resident Evil games. Just those for now. Maybe I'll do another video on the side stories, but just for now, it's only mainline Resident Evil games ranked from 1 to 10. First up, naturally, we have the original Resident Evil for PlayStation 1. This was the first Resident Evil in the franchise. It set the mood, it set the game style, it set up everything that came after. So naturally, Resident Evil 1, it set it all up. It's an amazing game. I'm going to give it 9 out of 10. It's 9 out of 10. It's an amazing game. Fantastic. I would give it a 10 out of 10. The only reason I'm not is because the next one that came out, Resident Evil Director's Cut and the Dual Shock Edition, to me, that's a 10 out of 10. If the Director's Cut never came out, I think I'd give the first Resident Evil a 10 out of 10. But seeing how Director's Cut was a better version, it had a range mode, it had better music in my opinion. The save room music mainly. I know people hate the mansion basement trumpets, but you know what? I kind of liked it. Maybe it's just because it's what I grew up with. I grew up with Director's Cut, but seeing Director's Cut, playing through Director's Cut, and then playing the original after, Director's Cut is a better game in my opinion. So the original Resident Evil, we're going at 9 out of 10. Resident Evil Director's Cut, 10 out of 10. I think this is the best game in the franchise. Right out the gate, Resident Evil Director's Cut Dual Shock Edition. The greatest hits label, I know, but that's iconic. It's iconic for that one. Resident Evil Director's Cut is a 10 out of 10. Moving along, this was people's first love in the Resident Evil franchise. Most hardcore Resident Evil fans who have been playing since day one, they're going to tell you the best one is Resident Evil 2. And would they be wrong? Absolutely not. It is probably the best game overall, next to another one, and I'll bring that one up later. Resident Evil 2, I think, for everyone who played the OG Resident Evil games, I think they all, not all, I think most people agree that Resident Evil 2 is the best, and Resident Evil 2 is amazing. I personally like Director's Cut better, maybe because, you know, I played the original Resident Evil with my uncle. He got me into it. I got Director's Cut, which was like playing it like he was back in the day, only it was my own version of it. But I think Director's Cut is better, but we can agree. If you say Resident Evil 2 is the best one in the series, I don't need to bring up my opinion, because it really, objectively, it probably is for most Resident Evil hardcore OG fans, not the new kids who play the new ones. You know what I'm talking about. If you're watching this video, chances are you're probably an old schooler. Resident Evil 2, the OG on the original PlayStation, that's gonna be another 10 out of 10. Fantastic. It got so many more people into the franchise. It capitalized on what the first one did with the mansion, only this time you're doing it in a whole city, Raccoon City. You find out more of the conspiracy, how it runs deep ties to through the police station and the mayor, and people are involved who would be really honestly terrifying if those people were involved in this giant scandal. Resident Evil 2, unbelievable. They capitalized on what Resident Evil 1 did and did it better in most people's eyes. Resident Evil 2 is a 10 out of 10. That's a given. Resident Evil OG, 10 out of 10. Next up, of course, we have Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Now, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis on PlayStation is definitely an amazing survival horror game. It plays like Resident Evil, like the other two games did. It takes place in Raccoon City, which is interesting because it takes place starting, I think it's supposed to be like halfway through Resident Evil 2 is when Resident Evil 3 starts. So it's cool because it's like a sequel, but it's also happening during the events of 2. So I thought that was cool, and it's different enough from 2. I wouldn't be playing 3, and aside from a couple angles in the police station, I wouldn't really mistake 3 for 2, unless you're in the police station, maybe. But obviously, different characters. I'm just saying the setting. They did recycle a couple of the settings. Was it lazy? I don't know. Maybe it was, but either way, Resident Evil 3 is a fantastic video game, and it's an excellent installment in the Resident Evil franchise. Another cool thing to point out about Resident Evil 3 is Nemesis. This is an enemy that you keep having to kill, and he keeps coming back. They definitely took that idea, obviously, from Resident Evil 2 with Mr. X. When he keeps coming back, you kill him, but you don't kill him, he comes back, that kind of thing. And Nemesis struck fear in a lot of our lives back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Nemesis was a force to be reckoned with, and that was truly scary, knowing every time you downed him, eventually he's going to break through a wall and he's going to get you. So Resident Evil 3, compared to 1 and 2, is really good. I think Resident Evil 3 is not as good as 1 and 2. I just think 1 and 2 were more polished, they were longer. Resident Evil 3 was a good amount shorter, but still fun. It still kept the vibes. Resident Evil 3, I'd have to say, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. I think it's a solid 8 out of 10. It's definitely one of the better ones in the franchise as a whole, but I don't think it's better than the 2 that came before it. But obviously, looking back now, the modern games, I think it's a lot better than the modern games, but it just didn't live up to 1 and 2. So Resident Evil 3, we're going to give 8 out of 10. Next up, we have the most underrated Resident Evil in the entire franchise. And I'm convinced if you played through this one and you completed it, that you agree that it is one of the top 3 in the entire franchise. I think most people think that. Correct me if I'm wrong. Leave it in the comments with what you think about Resident Evil Code Veronica X / Code Veronica. It was originally Code Veronica, but I think most people played it as Code Veronica X. You see, the story about Code Veronica is it came out originally on the Dreamcast, which didn't do crazy sales compared to PlayStation and other systems of that era. So it launched on Dreamcast, which is really sketchy back then. Didn't have an amazing media campaigns like the other ones did. Dreamcast failed, arguably. I love Dreamcast, but let's face it, it failed. And then they just kind of ported it over to PS2 and called it Code Veronica X. So Code Veronica is the original name on the Dreamcast, and Code Veronica X is just the same game on PlayStation 2. They just called it Code Veronica X. And the reason it didn't do nearly as good, when they ported it from Dreamcast to PlayStation, they didn't do a big media campaign releasing it that it was going to be on PS2 now and you missed out and the new Resident Evil is finally coming to PlayStation. They didn't really do that properly. So a lot of people slept on Code Veronica. And I think a lot of people, by the name, it was the first one without a number next to it. So I think some people perhaps thought that maybe it was a side story or maybe it wasn't as important to the franchise. Little do they know, in my opinion, Resident Evil Code Veronica is a top 2 in the series. That's right, not to mention, out of every game in the mainline story, the mainline franchise, which are the better games anyway, Code Veronica / Code Veronica X is extremely underrated. It's the most underrated in the entire franchise. Resident Evil Code Veronica X, I'm going to give 10 out of 10. I gotta do it. Resident Evil Code Veronica X is a 10 out of 10. I don't care what anyone says. Leave it in the comments if you disagree. If you think it's not nearly as good as the first 3, leave it in the comments. I'm really open to hearing your perspectives. Let's talk about it. Let's talk some Resident Evil. Leave it in the comments. Let me know what you think about Resident Evil Code Veronica. Because me personally, it's my probably second favorite. I'll give my rankings of each Resident Evil at the end of the video. So stick around till the end and then I will rate them all in order on which ones I like the most, all the way to the least. Or maybe vice versa. So Resident Evil Code Veronica X, we're given a 10 out of 10. I highly recommend all people play Resident Evil Code Veronica X at some point in their life. You will not regret it. It's tactful, it's difficult, it's rewarding, it's beautiful, it's amazing audio. The sound design and the music to Code Veronica X is so good. That's like top 2 save room themes in the entire franchise. You know what? I'm going to do a save room theme ranking shortly after this video. We're going to talk about some save room music. Just 2 years after Code Veronica came out, guess which one dropped an absolute bomb, in a good way, for Nintendo GameCube? That's right, the original Resident Evil remake. 2002 on the GameCube. Forgive me if I say these things about a couple games, but I think I need to break it down for you easier. So I think objectively, Resident Evil 4 is the best game across the board. Just generally, for every style of gamer, I think Resident Evil 4 is the best. But when it comes to the actual Resident Evil franchise, core to what Resident Evil was, with adding new elements, I think Resident Evil 2002 is the best Resident Evil game ever made. Compared to any game in the series, 2002 takes the cake. And in my opinion, it's not close. All these game companies keep remaking games. They need to take a page out of Capcom's book from the Resident Evil from 2002 on GameCube. This is the perfect definition of a remake. It stayed true to what it was. It didn't make it something else, didn't change gameplay drastically. It kept the core gameplay, added stuff to it to make it more unique and more strategic and more creative and fun. And it expanded the environment, changed the setting a little bit aesthetically, but it was still a mansion. It was still Resident Evil, but it was a new take on the older game, and it was just next level fun. Looking at that in 2002 on the GameCube, the cutscene leading up to the mansion with the dog, I was just like, oh, like it looked real, man. We thought the original Resident Evil in 96 looked good. Oh, hell no. Now we have real Resident Evil. 2002 GameCube, holy crap. That is the best one in the franchise when it comes to Resident Evil, judging a Resident Evil style game of the mainline series. Resident Evil 2002 is the best one. Resident Evil Director's Cut is my favorite one because of the nostalgia. I still like 2002 just as much. And Resident Evil 4 is objectively the best one for most audiences. I just got to specify that because I get Resident Evil on the brain and I go through all sorts of rating and how people like stuff. And this is just how us Resident Evil people get. So after that perfect 10 out of 10 Resident Evil in 2002, I didn't even give it a ranking back there, but Resident Evil Remake on GameCube it's an 11 out of 10. That's right, 11 out of 10 for Resident Evil on GameCube. It's that good. It's that good. You need to play it. If you play every game in the world and haven't played Resident Evil on GameCube, you need to change that. Get on it right now. Shut the video off. Go play Resident Evil 2002 if you haven't, and come back and thank me. After the Resident Evil Remake in 2002, we had Resident Evil 0. This was a prequel, so now they're getting really experimental with the series. Resident Evil 0 came out the same year as Resident Evil, and it was also on GameCube. And let me just note this, for anyone who remembers this back in the day, Nintendo was literally only family games, and then all of a sudden they remake Resident Evil, boom, on the GameCube. They throw the most hardcore horror on a console ever, and they drop it on a Nintendo system. We were all like, is this the Twilight Zone? What? We're dropping Resident Evil on the GameCube, and it's only on the GameCube? What is happening? This is crazy. Everyone was like, what? And then you put it in, you put the little disc in. Resident Evil. The strobes, when you're in the mansion, there's a storm going on. It was just like, oh my God, this is even scarier than before. And it's all new, too. There's a bunch of new aspects to it. So the same year that remake came out, Resident Evil 0 came out. So like I said, they're being really experimental now, and they're going for a prequel. So they remake the series, which is interesting because, you know, most remakes, they do a remake, then they do a sequel remake, or a remake to that sequel, and then they go remake, sequel, whatever. So Resident Evil took a different approach. They remade the first one, and then right after, same year, they released a prequel, Resident Evil 0. I'll say this. Resident Evil 0 is probably the hardest game in the series when it comes to mainline series. I think Resident Evil 0 is the hardest one, and I don't think any of them are close. Code Veronica has its moments, but I think Resident Evil 0 is the hardest overall, for sure. Aside from it being the most difficult, Resident Evil 0, I think, strayed a little bit too far from the Resident Evil story. They added in leeches and the Billy Cohen thing, and it seemed like they tried to add a lot of stuff, which would be fine in a sequel, but they crammed in a bunch of lore that had nothing to do, really, or wasn't brought to your attention at all in the original games. It's like they put in a bunch of stuff that's only in the prequel, and only a couple things kind of, you know, click with the first one. So that, on the story-wise, I think they slacked a little bit. One thing I think Resident Evil did amazing, shifting between the characters, that was insane. Switching between Billy and Rebecca is nuts. Doing strategy and puzzles with two different characters in two different areas, genius. That was genius. Even before co-op, you're co-oping with yourself with two characters. Genius. Resident Evil 0, props. The co-op swap that you do in-game with yourself, brilliant. Brilliant move. That was great. Aesthetic-wise, it was beautiful. It still felt like the Resident Evil remake. I think the Resident Evil remake had better level design, But Resident Evil 0 was still very cool, very eerie, very creepy. Not as creepy as the remake, but 0 was still pretty creepy. Very hard. And I think I got to take some points off because it didn't feel as Resident Evil as the remake was. And I love 0. And it is, in my opinion, the very last true Resident Evil. By true Resident Evil, whenever I say a true Resident Evil, I'm talking still camera angles and tank controls. Obviously, some of the camera angles move a little bit, but it's still 1 through 0 are the real true Resident Evils to me. So whenever I say true Resident Evil, I mean 1 through 0. And 0 was the last one with still camera angles and tank controls. R.I.P. R.I.P. I miss you so much, tank controls. I miss you so much, still camera angles. Now it's all action and first-person shooter. Help! Resident Evil 0 is a great game. It's the hardest game. And I'm going to admit it to you, okay? I got to admit it in this video. I've never beat it. I'm like right there, close to the end, but I've never beat it. But I know what happens, everything, so I'm still going to give it the rating. I'm going to give Resident Evil 0 a 7.5 out of 10. Resident Evil 0, 7.5 out of 10. I think that's fair. It's a great game. It lost a little bit of zazz, a little bit of momentum, but it's still fun. It's difficult. It's still a core Resident Evil, so it's not an average game. It's better because you have the still camera angles, tank controls, plus the character swapping. 7.5, maybe even 8, but we'll leave it at 7.5 for now. 7.5 for Resident Evil 0. Moving along. This is the game that got most people into Resident Evil, I think, ever. And on the grand scheme of things, I think it's been like literally forever that this game has pulled the most amount of people in. And that's, of course, the major hit that appears on every top 10 video game list of all time. That's Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 changed the formula. Now pay close attention. If you've been playing since day one, 1, 2, 3 and Code Veronica play gameplay style, I don't want to say identical because they have their own little like ways of doing things that differ a little bit, but it's still solid survival horror core gameplay. Resident Evil 4 took a completely different approach. They took it in the really close-up, clustered, kind of third-person clunky horror, which of course was fine. And a lot of people in 2005 were really looking for a dual analog third-person type of game because all the first-person shooters were coming out. First-person shooters and third-person shooters were really killing it in the 6th gen. So Resident Evil 4 really had to kind of compete, and I think that's where their headspace was at. So I have a lot to say about Resident Evil 4. The good and the bad. Let's give the good first. The good is Resident Evil 4. Let's get it out of the way. It's a 10 out of 10 video game. I don't think out of any take I have in this video, I don't think any will disagree that Resident Evil 4 OG is a 10 out of 10. That's, without question, 10 out of 10. Resident Evil 4. No, I don't even think I'm going to have any pushback. Resident Evil 4, if you disagree, leave it in the comments. Let me know. It's a 10 out of 10 because it's universal as a game. Let's face it, a lot of people don't want to play that old style of tank controls and still camera angles. To me, that's what Resident Evil is. All my highest rankings, aside from 4, of course, my highest rankings are the still camera angles, tank controls. To me, that's Resident Evil. When they start to differ, that's where things get a little shady. And that's what's such a conundrum to me about Resident Evil 4 is I think it's a perfect game. I think it's a 10 out of 10 game. But I also think, here comes the bad news, that Resident Evil 4 created the downfall of the entire franchise. Whoa. Now you're probably thinking, how can you even think that a 10 out of 10 game could be the downfall of an entire franchise? Well, I'm glad you brought it up. Here's why. Resident Evil 4 went more action-based. More action than horror. Granted, there is some tense moments, and it is kind of still the horror genre. But I wouldn't call it horror first. I'd say it's like an action horror, the way it played. The originals, that's horror, survival horror, limited ammo, and it's tougher, the puzzles are harder. In 4, you shoot a pigeon and they drop ammo. There's lots of ammo. You never really feel like you're running out of ammo with the weapons, where it's that intense, where you're really super low and you can't find any. You can usually find some in Resident Evil 4 really easily. Unlike 1, 2, and 3 in Code Veronica, where its ammo is much more scarce, you have to use it smart. Resident Evil 4, you can be shooting pretty much every zombie and not run out of ammo. You can't kill every zombie in 1, 2, 3 and Code Veronica and have ammo left to talk about it. You have to avoid some of them. They purposely do that so you keep the intensity up for those games. So that's what changed big time. It went to action, less horror, less intensity. You're not as scared because you're really shooting. You're running and gunning in Resident Evil 4. It's a run and gun horror. It's almost like an old school House of the Dead. Obviously, it's not as exaggerated. It's not on rails. Resident Evil 4 is a 10 out of 10 game, but it really changed the Resident Evil formula, and some people love the newer ones. I think they're... Oh, we'll get to that. Resident Evil 4, 10 out of 10. Next one up on the list is one of the most hated. I was one of those haters back when it came out. Resident Evil 5. So, here's my take on Resident Evil 5. This was the little saying I had for it whenever Resident Evil 5 got brought up back in the day, up until recently, basically. I still agree with it. Resident Evil 5 is a great video game, but it's not a great Resident Evil. And if you don't know what that means, I'll explain. Resident Evil 5 is an amazing game. If you've never played a Resident Evil before, and you hop on Resident Evil 5, co-op with your friends, your cousin, whoever, and you play co-op Resident Evil 5, you're gonna love it. It's an awesome game, objectively. But Resident Evil wise, it's really on the edge now, because 4 added an action element. Now 5 really pushed the action element even harder. So super action, stuff's blowing up, it's way more action. Chris is doing somersaults every other cutscene. Like, it's super intense, which is fun, but it does take away from the horror aspect even more than 4 did. So my rating for Resident Evil 5, and let me just say this, I love Resident Evil 5. I played Resident Evil 5 co-op many times. I like it just as much as the day, well, not the day I first played it, because when it first came out, I was like, this isn't Resident Evil, even though I was playing it all night until like 6 in the morning. I had like school the next day or something. It was one of those games. But I'm like, I hate this, but I can't stop playing because it still is Resident Evil. Resident Evil 5 is an amazing game, but it's on the downfall of Resident Evil, in my opinion. So here we go. Code Veronica is like peak, right? Because all the other ones before it were core. They were tank control, still camera angles. Resident Evil 4, sales went up, but the way Resident Evil played went down, in my opinion. It went down. But the sales went up, because now that you're making it easier, let's face it, Resident Evil 4 is easier than every game before it. That's fine. I think we can all agree, everyone who's played them, it's easier. When you make it easier, your sales go way up, because now more people can play it. If you're not a seasoned gamer and you try to play Resident Evil Code Veronica X, I got some bad news for you. You are not gonna like that. It's very difficult. So Resident Evil 5, we are going to rate it. It's tough, because do I rate it as a video game? I'll give separate ratings, okay? Because this is just how I'm gonna have to do it, okay? So rating it as a video game in general, just a video game, we're gonna give Resident Evil 5 8.5 out of 10. 8.5 out of 10. I'm strong. I'm good with that. 8.5 out of 10. Maybe a 9, depending on the day. 8.5 to 9 out of 10. It's not perfect, but it's damn good and it's damn fun, objectively. But as a Resident Evil game, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10. For pure Resident Evil vibes and where it came from and what the series was about, story-wise, gameplay, everything, I'm going to give Resident Evil 5 as a Resident Evil 5 out of 10. Resident Evil 6 comes next. This is probably the most hated on one in the franchise. Looking back, I definitely hated on it, but I liked it more than 5 originally because it felt more like a Resident Evil. It was darker. It felt more horror and scare oriented. And like you're in Raccoon City, it felt more like that than 5 did. 5, you're in Africa during the day and the zombies on dirt bikes. That didn't feel like Resident Evil. Resident Evil 6 felt a little bit more like Resident Evil. What wasn't as good as 5 was the controls and gameplay were more clunky than Resident Evil 5. But something better it had than Resident Evil 5 was you could play as multiple different characters. I think you can play as 7 or 8 characters total. I'll leave the number right here. You can play as this many. This many characters you can play as. Look at this number right here. This is how many characters you can play as in Resident Evil 6. But overall, I think Resident Evil 6 is a very fun game, and it's a very fun co-op game. And we can't take away from that, even though co-op kind of takes away from Resident Evil, funnily enough. But for good gameplay and fun replayability, co-op is huge, man. I can go back and play with my cousin. Shout out Joey. I can go back and play Resident Evil 5 and 6 co-op when we're at different houses. You know, we have to be together to play the other one. You know, it's 5 and 6 being co-op was kind of cool little midway of the Resident Evil franchise. Granted, the series, in my opinion, was falling apart at the time. Go back and play 5 and 6 co-op with your friends if you haven't since it came out, and it's more fun than you remember, trust me. 5 and 6 are super fun. But let's rate Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil 6, I'm going to give probably, I can't rate it higher than 0. So I'm going to give it, should I do it? I'm going to do it. We're going to give Resident Evil 6 a 6.5. Not quite a 6. It's a little bit better than a 6. We'll give it 6.5, 6.7-ish. We'll go mid to high 6 range out of 10. Because it's a really fun co-op game. It's sluggish, but it felt more like Resident Evil than 5. But I think 5 is still overall a better game. Now that I've gone back years later and played both, 5 is a better game, objectively. And I do love it. I do love playing it, but it's not that amazing. And it's not as memorable as 5 and all the ones before it, basically. So, next, we have my most controversial opinion. And you are going to get mad, so brace yourself. Grab a pillow and get ready to scream in it, because we're talking about Resident Evil 7. Biohazard. And I say it like that because I just don't like this game, and I'm sorry if you do. You can dislike me, but just hear me out, okay? Because I'm from day one. If you love Resident Evil 7, were you there in 1996? Were you? I don't think so. I think if you love 7 and you think it's one of the best in the series, I don't think you were there playing the original in the 90s. I don't think you were. Jokes aside, Resident Evil 7, objectively, as a horror game, in general, it's a good game for most people. If you want to play a horror game, be scary atmosphere, you know, all that, it's good in that way. But as a Resident Evil, you're going to get mad. Okay. For Resident Evil, it's a complete joke. Resident Evil 7 is a joke. It has nothing to do with Resident Evil, and then they just call it Biohazard because back in the day, Resident Evil in Japan was called Biohazard. So to call their new game that felt nothing like a Resident Evil, they call it Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. It was like, bro, really? Really? This is like the furthest thing in the series from the original Biohazard. So please, what the hell? Resident Evil is not a first-person shooter, man. It's not first-person shooter in a freaking, like, Texas Chainsaw Massacre house. This is not Resident Evil. Now this feels like Leatherface is gonna come out. This is like the inbred cannibal family from Kansas. Like, this is not Resident Evil, and it just didn't feel like Resident Evil either. And it was very upsetting. I don't like first person. I don't like them ripping off other horror aesthetics, especially Outlast, the game it literally copied. They were going towards action. Please pay attention, guys. They went from Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 going, pushing major action, blah, blah, blah. And now that Outlast came out, first person, run around, similar colors. I did a whole video on Resident Evil 7 copying Outlast. Check it out. I'll link it in the description. So Resident Evil 7 copied the aesthetic and the stylistic art design of Outlast. They saw, hey, horror's cool again. Guys, let's do a first-person horror. Even though we obliterated the series making it action, let's bring it horror back again because another guy did horror. How about you just stayed with horror? Imagine if 4, 5, and 6 didn't come out and they stayed true to like Code Veronica-esque 2 director's cut. Imagine what it would be like now. But no, they went action, and then they insulted us by coming back and making essentially an Outlast clone. Oh, but you can shoot in Resident Evil 7 and you can't shoot in Outlast. It doesn't matter. They clearly copied it. Again, check the video in my description. You will see Outlast literally was copied by Resident Evil 7. So for that reason, I'm going to give a harsh 4 out of 10 for Resident Evil 7. No, it's a 3 out of 10. Resident Evil 7 is a 3 out of 10. And I think that's even high. It might even be 2. I don't know. I'll just leave it as 3 because I don't want to insult people too much. But it's not better than a 3. That's for sure. For sure. Resident Evil 7 is not better than a 3 out of 10. For Resident Evil. Nope. Sorry. Anyways, besides that it copied Outlast and it's a completely different game, they insulted us by Chris Redfield's name in it. It has nothing to do. It doesn't look like Resident Evil. If that game was not called Resident Evil 7, you would never think it was a Resident Evil. And for that reason, I'm out. Resident Evil 7, no. If you think that's good, go back and play the older ones. I beg you. Go play Code Veronica. Another one. I bet if you love 7 and you think it's the best, I bet you haven't played through Code Veronica. Look at yourself. Don't look at me. Look into yourself. I bet you didn't. Really ask yourself that question. Did I play Code Veronica and did I beat it? No. Not if you love 7 better than the rest. You definitely didn't. Go play Code Veronica. That's an order. Next up, we have Resident Evil 8. Hot off the trail of Resident Evil 7. It's still a first-person shooter. There's a lot of elements they made wanting to feel like Resident Evil 4, of course, right? So they really wanted to do Resident Evil 4-esque stuff, but still keep it first person. They were trying to expand, but they still didn't want it. They wanted to keep it first person and the modern horror stuff. I think 8 is a little bit better than 7, but I still don't think it's amazing. And now you got werewolves. When were werewolves in Resident Evil? Come on, man. You're just like, damn, what are you doing, bro? Werewolves? Werewolves? Dude, not the vibe for Resident Evil. And I love werewolves. American Werewolf in London, Paris, Dog Soldiers, Bad Moon, Howl, Underworld. I love werewolves, but they're not a Resident Evil enemy or creature. You're just throwing stuff in there. You're trying stuff, random stuff out, and you just hope it sticks. And obviously it'll stick for the people who never played the old ones. But it's an insult to us classic Resident Evil gamers who like the classic still camera angles and tank controls. So Resident Evil 8, I'm going to give a 4. 4 out of 10. I don't think it was anything special. It's barely memorable. I played through it and I barely remember, like Lady Dimitrescu, I remember her, and I remember the werewolves, and it's pretty much just nothing to write home about, in my opinion. So we're going to give it 4.5. We'll give it 4.5 out of 10 for Resident Evil. So, next, I'm going to lump these two together. Sort of. Or I'm going to talk about them together. I'm not going to consider them the same. Resident Evil 2 Remake. The plus. Resident Evil 2 Remake is a fantastic game. It's beautiful. It's a nice remake. And it feels good. It's still Resident Evil 2. But it was not still camera angles and tank controls. It's not as good as the remake on GameCube. Not even close. But it is still a fantastic game. And I like the remake it too. It's very good. It was well done. They made it like Resident Evil 4. They didn't really remake it. They remade it and changed the gameplay. It wasn't like a remake like the GameCube one. So for that, I'm going to take 2 points off. And I'm going to say the Resident Evil 2 remake is an 8 out of 10. Original Resident Evil 2, 10 out of 10. Original remake of 1, 10 out of 10. But Resident Evil 2 remake, we're going to go 8 out of 10. I know a lot of people probably think it's 10 out of 10. That's fine. I won't argue that. I understand why you think that. But me, who's played them all like tons of times and started from the beginning, I think it's a solid 8 out of 10. Good game. Good game. Not perfect. Not close to perfect, but close enough to be like, yeah, it's a really good game, right? So Resident Evil 4 remake. This one, I did like it, but I feel like the original Resident Evil 4, like whenever I think of Resident Evil 4 remake, I try to think of a scene and it takes me back to the original Resident Evil 4, which makes me think it's more memorable and a better game. So Resident Evil 4 remake, it's good, but it didn't hook me in like the Resident Evil 2 remake. I think the 2 remake is probably more of a better remake. Resident Evil 4 felt more of a newer game, and it is still a remake, but it felt a little newer. I'm going to give the Resident Evil 4 remake like a 7.7. 7.7. It's a little bit less than the Resident Evil 2 remake, but it's still a really good game. Objectively, it's really... So that's the Resident Evil 2 remake, Resident Evil 4 remake. So that about does it for every single Resident Evil in the entire franchise. I've ranked them all. So let me know what you think of my rankings. I'm curious. What's your favorite? Do you think I got something wrong? Did I forget something? Leave it in the comments. Let me know. I'm going to constantly make these videos, especially about Resident Evil. I make at least a few Resident Evil videos a year. So hit the subscribe button if you're a Resident Evil fan. And let me know in the comments what you think. But before we go, I'm going to tell you my favorite in a descending list. Okay, we're going to start with the best one, in my opinion. I'm not going to say the best. I'm going to say my favorite, because I can decipher the two. Okay. My favorite, Resident Evil Director's Cut. That'll never be beaten because I got the nostalgia. It's what got me into the series, okay? Resident Evil Director's Cut. Pump 1 in there too. We're not going to decipher. Resident Evil 1 and Director's Cut was number 1. Second, Resident Evil 2002, the remake. And I like it just as much. I just prefer Director's Cut because I have the nostalgia. I have nostalgia with 2002. They're literally like almost identical, but if I had to pick, Director's Cut /1, and then the remake of 1. So we got Director's Cut, the 2002 original remake, and then next up we have Code Veronica X, which is number 3. Code Veronica X is definitely stuck at number 3. That one's so good. Sometimes it feels like it's number 2. I'll play through it, and sometimes I like it better than the remake, but overall I like the remake better. So we got Director's Cut, remake 2002, and Code Veronica. So next up, after Code Veronica, we have the original Resident Evil 2. Again, I like them just as much. Fantastic. Absolute banger game. 10 out of 10. Resident Evil 2 is number 4. Number 5 on the list, I'm going to go Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, the original Nemesis, of course. I just remembered I haven't actually gave a review for a Resident Evil 3 remake. So I actually kind of forgot about it because I haven't played it. So I'll rate that later. But the general consensus is a lot of people don't like it because they cut out a lot of content and it's short and they kind of rushed it. So I'm going to give a guess rating. A guess rating. I haven't played it. I'll stream it eventually. Follow me on Twitch, Carbon Cyber. Twitch.tv/Carbon Cyber. Follow me on Twitch. I will play through Resident Evil 3 Remake. I'm going to guess I'll give it a 5 out of 10. That's generous. We'll guess that Resident Evil 3 Remake is 5 out of 10. Back to my ratings. We got Director's Cut, the Remake 2002, Code Veronica, 2, 3 Nemesis, and then we got Resident Evil 4, and then we got Resident Evil 5, 6, 8, and 7. That's my list. Oh, actually, you know what? I gotta throw some in there. Director's Cut, original GameCube remake, Code Veronica, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, RE2 remake, RE4 remake, 8, 7. So that's my list. I'll have it typed out right here so you don't have to listen to me babble about that all again. But here's my list right here. You can check it out. And yeah, that's my rankings of all the Resident Evil games. If you like any Resident Evil games, you are a friend here. I don't care which one's your favorite. It's all love, baby. We all love Resident Evil. We all have that attachment to this amazing franchise, best franchise ever, next to Halo. Again, my opinion. Resident Evil is the best. And that's what makes us so connected, is that we love the same franchise. And each game got us into the series and has its own place in our hearts. So leave it in the comments what you think of the Resident Evil franchise. What's your favorite? If you're so bold, leave your whole list of favorite Resident Evils in the comments. I'll respond to it. I'd love to see all of your favorite Resident Evils, top 3, top 5, whatever. Send them all. Leave it in the comments. Thanks everybody for watching, and make sure that you like and subscribe, and also that your residents are always evil.